Ray Gricar disappears. For a moment, it looks like nothing unusual. Then his laptop turns up in a river. But the hard drive is missing. Not lost. Removed. And once you realize that, this stops looking like a normal disappearance. Ray Gricar wasn't just another missing person. He was the district attorney of Center County, Pennsylvania, which means his days weren't random. There was structure to them. People knew where he was supposed to be, and when. That's what makes April 15, 2005 hard to read. From everything that's known, the day didn't begin any differently. He left home, went out, and for a while, nothing stands out. No argument, no visible stress, nothing that clearly points to a problem. And usually, when something like this happens, you can trace it back to a moment. A small shift that only becomes important later. Here, that moment is missing. At some point during the day, he steps outside his normal pattern. Not dramatically, not in a way that raises alarm right away, but enough that, looking back, it becomes the last clear point anyone can rely on. Later, his car is found near the Susquehanna River. What stands out isn't just the location, but the condition. There's no damage. Nothing inside suggests a struggle or urgency. It doesn't look abandoned in a panic. It looks like it was left there calmly. And that detail changes things. Because when something happens suddenly, people don't leave scenes like that. There's usually some kind of disruption, even if it's small. Something out of place. Here, everything feels controlled. Which creates a problem. Because if nothing suggests panic, then whatever happened didn't begin as something forced. At least not in that moment. It looks like a decision. And for a second, that explanation almost works. People do that sometimes. They take a day, clear their head, don't tell anyone. They take time. They go somewhere without telling anyone. But that only works if the day continues. In this case, it doesn't. There's no confirmed movement after that point. No call, no sighting, nothing that clearly places him anywhere else. The timeline just stops. And that's not how real life usually works. People leave traces without trying. A camera picks them up, a transaction shows up, someone remembers seeing them. Here, that doesn't happen. And when a timeline ends that cleanly, the question shifts. It's no longer just where he went. It becomes, what happened after that moment? That erased everything that should have come next? The first real piece of evidence doesn't come from where he was last seen. It shows up later. Weeks after Ray Gricar disappears, his laptop is found in the Susquehanna River. At first, that sounds like progress. After all the uncertainty, there's finally something physical. Something that isn't based on memory or assumption. But that feeling doesn't last long. Because once the laptop is examined, one detail stands out immediately. The hard drive isn't there. Not damaged from the water, not unreadable. It's simply missing. And that's where the situation starts to shift. A laptop ending up in a river can be explained in different ways. It could have been thrown in. It could have ended up there after the fact. Even the timing of when it entered the water is hard to pin down. But the missing hard drive doesn't fit into any of those simple explanations. That requires a separate step. At some point, someone had the device in their hands. They had enough time to open it, remove a specific component, and then leave the rest behind. And that changes how you have to look at it. Because now you're not dealing with something that was just lost or destroyed. You're dealing with something that was handled first. Which raises a more precise question. Not just where the laptop was found, but what happened to it before it got there. If you try to place that into a normal sequence of events, it doesn't settle easily. If he was alone, if this was something that ended near the river, then you have to assume he took that step himself. That he opened the laptop, removed the drive, and then discarded what was left. That's possible. But it adds intention at a point where everything else is unclear. And it doesn't really explain why the drive would matter more than the device itself. Because if the goal was simply to get rid of everything, the easiest way would have been to throw the entire laptop away, intact. Instead, something was separated. And once you start from that detail, the earlier timeline doesn't feel as straightforward anymore. The car, the location, the lack of visible disruption, all of it begins to connect in a different way. Not as a single event, but as a sequence where something was done first, and only then was everything else left behind. And that's the part that makes this harder to explain. Because the laptop doesn't just show up as evidence. It shows up already changed. Already incomplete. Which means whatever mattered most in that moment was no longer inside it. Once the laptop enters the picture, the earlier explanations don't quite hold the same weight. Before that, you could still look at this as a situation that developed on its own. Someone steps away, something goes wrong, and the trail just fades out. But the missing hard drive makes that harder to accept without questions. So the first explanation people usually turn to is suicide. And on the surface, there are things that point in that direction. He drove out, his car ends up near the river, and then there's no confirmed movement after that. It's a pattern that is shown up in other cases. But when you slow it down, it doesn't sit cleanly. Because it doesn't explain the extra step with the laptop. If someone is acting in that state of mind, the focus isn't on removing parts from a device. There's no clear reason to separate the hard drive from the rest of it and then leave everything else behind. It's not impossible. But it adds a level of intention that doesn't naturally fit. So then the second idea comes in. That he chose to disappear. Not in a sudden way, but in a controlled one. That he stepped out of his life on purpose, knowing exactly how to avoid being found. And again, at first, that almost works. He understood systems, he knew how investigations function, and if someone wanted to leave without a trace, he would have a better chance than most. But the same problem shows up again. If that was the goal, why leave anything behind at all? Why risk a piece of evidence turning up later, even in that condition? And more importantly, why separate the one part that actually contains information, instead of just taking everything with you? It doesn't line up cleanly. Because a planned disappearance usually tries to reduce variables, not create new ones. And this does the opposite. So you end up in a place where both of the simpler explanations still exist, but neither of them fully explains what you're looking at. Each one works up to a point. And then something small breaks it. And that's what starts to shift the focus. Not toward a single answer, but toward the gaps between them. Because those gaps are where the case actually lives. Not in what can be explained, but in what keeps resisting a simple explanation. Once those first explanations stop holding together, the case shifts into a different space. Not one where you suddenly have answers, but one where the simple ones don't feel complete anymore. And that's where the idea of another person starts to come in. Not as a claim, not as a conclusion, but as something you can't fully ignore once you look at the details together. The car doesn't suggest urgency. The timeline doesn't continue past a certain point. And the only object that shows up later has already been altered before anyone finds it. On their own, each of those things can still be explained in isolation. But when you put them next to each other, they start to lean in the same direction. And that direction isn't entirely comfortable. Because it suggests that whatever happened didn't end where the trail stops. It continued somewhere else first. Somewhere that never becomes part of the record. And that's where the case becomes harder to follow. Because there's no clear place to look. No confirmed moment where another person enters the timeline, no direct interaction that can be pointed to and built around. Everything stays just outside of reach. But at the same time, the absence of that doesn't settle the question either. Because if someone did handle that laptop before it ended up in the river, then there was a point where that interaction took place. And that point exists whether it was seen or not. Which means part of this case happened in a space that never left a visible trace. And once you accept that possibility, even cautiously, it changes how the rest of the timeline feels. Because now you're not just dealing with what can be confirmed. You're also dealing with what could have happened in between those confirmed moments. And that space in between is where things start to lose their clarity. Not because there's no information at all, but because the one piece that might have tied everything together isn't there anymore. The hard drive is gone. And whatever it contained is gone with it. So instead of closing the gap, the evidence leaves it open. Wider than before. And that's what makes this part of the case difficult to settle. Because you're not just missing a person. You're missing the one detail that might have explained why everything else unfolded the way it did. By now, you can take everything that's known and try to put it together in a way that actually makes sense. You have a clear last location, a car left without any sign of urgency, and a timeline that stops earlier than it should. Then, weeks later, the only physical evidence appears, but not in a form that helps. The laptop is there, but the one part that could explain anything is already missing. At that point, the issue isn't a lack of explanations. There are several ways to read what happened. The problem is that none of them holds together the whole way through. You can follow one version for a while and it feels reasonable, at least up to a certain point. Then something small starts to push against it. A detail that doesn't quite belong, or a step that asks for more intention than the rest of the situation seems to support. So you shift to another explanation. And for a moment, that works better. But then you reach the same kind of break again. Not in the same place, but in the same way. And after a while, that pattern becomes hard to ignore. Because it doesn't matter which direction you take, you end up circling the same problem. And that's the point where this stops being about what happened. And starts being about what's missing. The hard drive sits right in the middle of that. Not as proof of one answer, but as the one thing every explanation has to deal with, and none of them fully can. Once it's gone, everything around it loses context. Not completely, just enough that nothing ever feels finished. So what you're left with isn't a clear conclusion. It's a set of events that almost connect, but never fully do. And the closer you try to get to an answer, the more it pulls you back to the same place. Right to that missing piece. And everything that might have been on it.